for illumined life to be birthed into form. I am the truth. I am the light. Illumine, beloved divine.
So hello there everyone, and welcome to this video with me here today. Today is actually a continuation of a previous video in which we discussed the topic of what is currently going on in our collective. But we've talked about it more from the perspective of creation cycles and the evolutionary development and unfolding, not just of our species, but the entirety of what is taking place at this time in this creation cycle, and how everything has its seed of life, its origin, its intentional purpose, and then a trajectory of life force that helps it to fulfill that purpose, and then the unfolding of that purpose, and then a completion. So each of these tinier completions actually add up to a greater overall completions. And as you know, we can talk about several levels of the several layers, because this is a layering perspective. It always is like this in creation, and we can address every single level, you know, from conspiracy theories to the greatest developmental cycles in the grandiose picture of all life. But today we're actually going to talk about what this means for us collectively and as a planet, because as I was recently witnessing some of the developments that this current so-called global crisis, right, has triggered, it really kind of caught me off guard. And I sort of felt into how this collective panic feels like. But there is something much deeper behind that. And so as I was witnessing what is happening, and, you know, it's the same for every country. Every country is sort of like creating these tools and pathways of how to move forward, you know, how to move through this. And as you know, we've often had on our planet certain crisis conditions already before, numerous amounts of times. But if you look closely, you will see that none of them can actually compare to what is happening now, because this is different. And you might say, well, the collective panic and fear and devastation and all that is at its majority and at its peak right now. And it's true, there's a lot of collective fear that's always being purged, you know, from our collective field awareness during such difficult transitions. But it's not all about that. So when I looked into this unfolding, and I was watching a video that this tarot reader was doing about the current conditions. It was a beautiful walk through what Spirit is letting us know, and how actually this is, again, bringing people into a different state of pause, of reflection, not being able to do so much on the outside, because, as you know, I don't know how it is in your country, but even in our country, which is probably one of the smallest countries in the world, certain measurements are being taken that are sort of slowing lives down, you know, the way people work, the way people receive payments in the world, you know, the way we get our food supplies, things like that. And it's coming to a state of halt. You know, here we actually also had events. This is a touristic place, and the majority of probably funds are coming from tourism, and now everything's closing down, even our yearly events. And also public transport, which is difficult for, you know, those of us here who are very much already in isolated spaces and conditions. You know, people who have their means of transport, that's okay. But if you don't have that, and if you're kind of hooked on, you know, public transport, it's kind of difficult now, because all life sort of seemed to come to this halt. And as I was first receiving the news, I felt like this panic that is sort of naturally built in the human organism. It's like in the body, this survival fight or flight mode. And there's a lot of us who've been working with our light teams as light beings, specifically on certain parts of human conditioning. But beyond that, we actually worked on specifically certain themes that were most difficult to break through when it comes to ascension and ascending the physical bodies. So a lot of us have already been experiencing things like very difficult periods of stagnancy or stagnation, and feeling that deprivation of resources and not being able to always move that freely. And we know that, like for me, life in hibernation or quarantine is not so much different, because I already live an isolated life, or I have been living that kind of lifestyle for the past, let's say, 7 years or so. So it's been interesting to see how when you're living such a lifetime, everything becomes an inner cultivation of your inner resources, especially when you learn how to work within the framework of life force and how it moves you, and how in every step of the way it sort of guides you forward, no matter how seemingly stagnant or on halt these outside conditions are. So for me, not much has changed, except for the public transport or not being able to get our food that easily. But when I actually tuned into beyond that, I got very quickly a message. But it was actually a message from Earth herself this time. And I was shown that specifically in the times to come, there will be specific planetary so-called reset points, or points of planetary reset, which is sort of connected with planetary ascension, which is her ascension, right? Gaia's ascension into her own new light field formation or template. So those of you who are doing your own inner cultivation of life force mastery and light body merge with the physical body configurations being altered so drastically in the past few years, especially, you've been noticing quite a few ascension symptoms, and I've had quite a few already myself. And when the world is screaming of this worldly health crisis, I was feeling, well, I'm in my own health crisis, but out of different reasons. So those of us have actually been pushing through these energies, and it's like Earth was trying to give birth to something much grander. So when I actually tuned into this event, and we know that we've never had such a slowing down and actually resetting of the way we function, the way our civilization functions. And it's more difficult now because we're not so like used to being sustainable from within our current frameworks of, let's say, certain cities or villages or towns, but also how we are dependent upon each other globally with the global transport, you know, and the airwave activities and all of that, and how now everything has sort of been pushed on halt in this reset mode. So what I was tuning into was Earth herself, because she's in this major threshold point. Like, she wanted to have her own reset mode, because that's what was needed for her to actually have this happen, because it is so grand what is happening. You know, for how many years people have been talking about the event and how it's going to be this cosmic event coming somehow from this cosmic stream of light, you know, but these cosmic rays are constant. It's not one singled out event. I've been talking about this for years. It's like things that are gradually building towards planetary ascension. And those of you who are following through and with the planetary body, you've been feeling just the same as the planet. So you've been noticing periods of stagnation that planet has been feeling, because the way we've been living upon, not just as earthlings, right, what we're doing with the planet, but a certain framework of density on this planet has been in its surpassing mode, right? It's become stagnant. And those of us who've been ascending for so long, in these last transitioning months, we've been feeling a lot of that stagnation. I have been feeling it, and it's at times become so unbearable that I myself thought, you know, to myself, these mini dialogues that you have, monologues actually you have with yourself, are like, you know, if this continues like this is not going to be a beautiful place to live, not just, you know, environmentally and our ecology and environmentalism and all of that, you know, resources, but from a point of like really feeling suffocating from within, because there's such an immense stagnancy. And it's actually Earth herself that was processing through these stagnations, as she herself was dying out of her old cycle and being pushed into a new one. And those of us who've been doing light body work ascension through our light teams, we've actually been changing some of the configurations, and we've been sort of propelling Earth in her own spiraling movements forward, because these cosmic rays are just like activities of what we sometimes call demonstrations of light, or, you know, sometimes you might even call a light intervention. But these cosmic rays have all been feeding into the magnetic system of Earth, into her own template, pushing her forward. But just like you and me and all of us, we sometimes need these bigger reset points when certain bigger aspects or portions of our life body are coming in and trying to come in, there needs to be something of a pause, like a major, breakthrough created in this way, when a halt is almost like holding space within that void. So imagine how many people are on Earth at this time, probably over 7.7 billion, right? And it's sort of like, imagine all these people living their status quo realities most of the time, and this creates not as much space for this to happen, because it's almost like there's a lot of density still pulling and pulling, like daily activities that add up, dividing 7.7 billion, right? So you multiply when you think of it in that direction, and what you get is a lot. We've been talking about entropy for so long, and physics and how things function in that way, and spirituality based on life force and ascension understanding actually need to add up, and they do add up when you actually tune into the nature of life and how everything comes from life itself, even physics or all the other branches of knowledge, right? So Earth herself is going through something major. So when I looked at this and I was like, did this ever happen before? And we had many crises, scenarios before on our planet, probably even bigger. But this time it's sort of like everything was guided to create, whether you say this was out of fear or panic or, what would happen, trying to prevent the natural flow of what we've talked about, the evolutionary cycle will unfold either way, whatever we do. But there's something bigger, like a bigger mechanism of how and why this was guided in this way, that it came into this point of this reset. And this brought, of course, a lot of uncertainty for people, because how will life be triggered back, into reality? And funny enough, just when I received this guidance, the same night, my phone had this reset. And I've, been living with a phone that keeps on resetting all the time for about a year. It's really weird. And seeing how technology is matching with our own inner, light system, it just hasn't been the same for me ever since. But this time it felt like it really died. And it was blank, and I couldn't get into the phone itself. I couldn't do anything. So then after a while, I just said, okay, I just confronted it. And I said to myself, then that's how it's going to be. I can't even get it fixed because there's no public transport. I can't go anywhere. I'm in an isolated place. Neighbors are all panicky. No one will take you there with their own car. And, people are holding onto themselves at this point, pretty much. And it's like, what can you do? Then life will just change. And, when you've been living like I have in this hermitage for so long, when you become more inwardly resourceful, that's one thing. But the other is you rely more on your senses and this guidance, which is always telling you that everything will unfold naturally. Either way, that life will continue, because life force is nothing but continuation of life. It's just constantly being altered and modified according to the principles of life that are currently being able to be sustained in a level of density where we are. But this felt to me like a totally major reset of density and totality, and even though you might say, well, it might last a few weeks, maybe a month, maybe longer, but either way, this is not, such a major duration of time in which people can become, awaken en masse. Perhaps not, but it is something that causes us to explore aspects of us that we haven't before. Like, I was totally altered by these 7 years in these mountains. Like, I was mostly just by myself with nature and sort of attuning to a different way of life or lifestyle. You have to become everything to yourself, from a healer to motivator to whatever. It's just you yourself being your ultimate guide. You're not much dependable on other, sources or people or, things in life. So for me, it's not that different. But when I tune into the collective, it is, because we're still connected, right? And, you are affected, at least in the way you either get your food supplies or not, And so when I was thinking into that, and tuning into that, what sort of took over was this feeling of something grandiose taking place, like this feeling of awe, like, wow, that's deep, that's big, something big must be birthing, and this is something that was able to come about. Like, we've never actually stopped like transport and things like that, or closed borders down, like literally, and we've had wars and you know, more difficult things already. But somehow there's something like a bigger force that's driving the wheel, that's guiding the narrative of life to be this way, and for that to be creative in this way. So the best we can do is attune to what this means for us. When I did this tuning into, and you can do this yourself, you can penetrate all the layers, and the first layer is usually panic. The second layer is fear that's behind this panic. Then there's a lot of feeling of agony. Behind that agony, there's a lot of frustration. Behind that frustration, there's a lot of stagnation. And then you get to the point of how life needs to move to the next octave. It's just natural. So when you come to the final boundaries of those layers you're kind of penetrating through with your consciousness, find yourself there and be okay with that for a while, and just be okay with that sense of not knowing. We've been doing that, and we've been talking a lot about the unknown and this new creation cycle that's, we can already tune into it, but it's not like physically in density apparent yet. We've been talking about that in my group, the work I do. So it's been quite interesting. You know, these developments are still taking us forward, and it's much necessary. And I'll be talking about this, I'll be addressing this much further and deeper in the updates that I do on my work page, which is called Ascension, and it's on Patreon for those of you who are interested in ever joining, because this is sort of like a deeper insight into not just like channeling, but what Ascension, you know, all the components of Ascension that are sort of being presented through spirit at different aspects of what we call different timelines as we move through this evolutionary, not just saying, well, I already know what Ascension is, period, so I'm just gonna, you know, be with that. But there's a lot that is changing as we're being moved through the spiral, right? That's propelling us forward. So I was told there's going to be several of these planetary reset points that, of course, coincide with collective reset points. But we as individuals, we also have our own reset points. And sometimes they collide or correspond with these. Sometimes they might happen sooner. If you're a volunteer soul like myself, we usually experience things in advance. We're kind of like harbingers of this change naturally. So just before this happened and I got the major news announcement, that was last week for 2 days. There was such an immense, intense energy coming through, and I was mostly out on the sun, but the sun was so intense. The energy coming through was so intense that I was devastatingly tired. I couldn't do much. I couldn't do anything. And then this started happening, and I felt like, wow, you know, this is something so major, but we can't see it because most of the times, as you know, we're dealing with stuff that's always somewhere there and somewhere in front of us, or we think we need to deal with stuff. But this is sort of like slowing, not just our minds, but the bodies. The bodies can be slowed down as well. But at the same time, when I was tuning into the messages, it's important to keep the life force growing and expanding through our bodies, because this isn't the end. It's just a temporary reset, vibrationally, existentially, evolutionary, for the planetary ascension and of course is the ascension we experience. This is those humans who are collectively ascending. As for the rest of the collective, I don't know, because it's their own free will choice as to what they will get from this experience, how they will sort of benefit or not. It's up to them. But I can only speak on the behalf of myself, and those of you who are also physically ascending, you will feel yourself moving with these cycles and these waves, and you will also always be able to see or penetrate through the experience and going into the deeper aspects of what's really taking place. So there will be several more of these, but they won't all like come at the same, like they won't all look the same, you know. They'll be different. There'll be different triggers. But in the next coming few years, that's sort of like something that I was shown will concurrently happen. It doesn't mean, well, every year. It just, maybe it's a period of years, and it really is up to the planet. And those of you who are connected with the core of the planet and the planetary template by doing your own templating work, which is a part of the physical ascension, of course, you will be always getting the messages. Perhaps a little in advance, but it really takes us to be aligned and deeply rooted. And sometimes that's difficult when it feels like the outside reality is telling you, this is the way it is, this is how things are now, everything stopped. Things didn't stop. life force is, you know, the essence of life is always on the move, on the go. So I actually pulled some cards, and I got 3 cards from the nature oracle, and one was the mountain with the message of strength and, you know, that power through resilience and perseverance. The second one was actually waterfall with the message of the effortless nature of life. Like there's always life force when you look at the waterfall, and we have plenty of them here, so I've been really merging with their essence for quite a few years. And the last message was about ceremony, with invocation, and it was like us creating the ceremony, and a lot having to do with prayer and becoming more silent. You know, when you look at the people around, people who are experiencing life at denser levels, they might not take this as seriously. So even if they're told, yeah, this is happening and these precautionary measures are necessary, not all of them are actually considering that. You know, you see a lot of people just minding their own business either way. As I've already talked about this before, it is important to be conscious, because everything has a consciousness, even a virus, even this microorganism, whatever we're dealing with. Like, the human consciousness invites things in, and at the level of the planetary council, connecting with, you know, further councils, they're all one, basically. It's all just a council of life, you know, and they're all interconnected, and there's always this cooperation taking place, and everything is invited in and through the experience. So when the earth has her own, let's say, a request for her own benefit, for her own advancement, this request will also be considering the humanity, the population living on earth at this time. So always the gentlest measures are considered first. It's always like this. That's why sometimes things take time, and we don't always see that. We want to rush ahead. But for this experience to be the gentlest and most graceful for the planet and its inhabitants, not just those beings who are actually physically ascending with the planet, but also those who are not, it's still all are considered. That's who it is within the planetary council of light. And so when we understand this, we can become more susceptible to the flow of what is. And it's interesting, right, how even the name Corona, kind of how it means the crown right on top of the head, like the corona around the sun, right? When you can notice the corona around the sun, which sometimes becomes apparent in certain conditions. There's many pictures like that, right, being taken, especially nowadays. And how when the human gets this virus, apparently the disease, how it's so much associated with the lungs and respiratory system, which is interesting, right? The living lungs of the planet have been so abused for the past few decades, and even the earth taking a new breath, like taking in a new breath of life. Like when you do, right, when you take a breath, you don't notice this, but first there's like this slight pause. We are being resetted in a way, like every day, every micro moment. It's just we're not focalized with our consciousness enough to perceive our reality in such nano aspects, right, of observation. So we don't notice everything, but it's still there. It's the same here. It's just that this is, instead of being so nano and so minute or micro in its nature, this is more like a macro, which we also can see. We're tuning into the consciousness through our human consciousness, but there is greater consciousness, and there always have been greater consciousnesses of life. And one of them, of course, it begins with the planetary consciousness. So those of you who are doing the work, you have merged with the planetary consciousness already. It's not like I've done this and this is it. It's like we continuously are still merging with the planetary essence, because it's constantly changing at this point. So all of these activities, such as the cosmic rays, are assisting with pushing the earth into her new space. It's like, just like our light body dynamics is pushing us into a new space of existence, like a new co-creational human, right? It's like a new birth. The same as with the planet, birthing a new aspect, version of herself. So this means that she's almost like being put out of her quarantine, which was a place held together magnetically for a very long time, as you know, like for ages or eons. Now this is all opening up. It's inviting in this cosmic creativity and pushing it in a spiral motion into the next. It's like, right, with the birth, it's like the umbilical cord is the guideline, and then entering out into a new experience. So it's kind of like that. So do pay attention and try to just merge with this conscious awareness yourself. See if you receive any more of your own or additional information. But as always, I hope I was able to explain a little bit of what's happening. There's much more, of course, but I'm going to try to go deeper on Patreon for those of you who are there. As my regulars, thank you so much. And those of you who perhaps are considering or are new, welcome. And for the rest of you, as always, so much love, wisdom, and power, as for all. And I'll be seeing you, and take care of yourselves, okay? Nurture yourself and be safe in any way. Just really being calm. And those of you who are really with these energies as they are, you're going to feel there's actually a lot of peace and calm, a lot of serenity beyond the first few layers of the onion. And then when you find that sweet spot, like connect that presence with the presence of earth and merge and stay in that space for a while and try to anchor that for a while. Now people are saying they can't go to work, they have much more time on their hands. Well, this is the time, you know, time is being created. It's not actually that time exists, but more space is being created. Like cultivating this new experience into life. So thank you for staying tuned. As always, so much love. Bye-bye for now.
Come into my world, the world of the elven song, magical.